As a veteran, I don't understand why cops are allowed to be cowards and civilians aren't. Untrained civilians are not going to react to dangerous situations well, so we should expect the trained individuals to, control that situation. I remember in Afghanistan, when I was embedded with my infantry company, I was their medic. We had a situation where a truck was barreling down on us in an area where we had had suicide bombers in trucks before. And we didn't shoot that guy. Instead, we went through all of our SOPs, signaling to him and waving our weapon towards him to try to be like, hey, you keep driving and there are going to be consequences. And then it would have escalated to non-lethal force attempting to disable the engine block. And then finally, as a last resort, shooting the driver. The guy in charge of that situation was an 18-year-old kid who could barely read. But that was the expectation. He has training, the civilian doesn't.
What's up, everybody? Major Retired Richard Ojeda here. And in America, regular everyday people don't have any power and don't get the benefit of the doubt, especially when the folks pointing guns at them are shielded by a uniform and a badge.
That guy with training needs to do more than the one who doesn't. But apparently not in America. I've been driving for 3 days. I stopped on the side of the highway. I've been coming from Oklahoma back to New York because I don't fly after the helicopter incident. And I just keep seeing these news stories where it's just worse and worse and worse. And I've seen the video and it's like, oh no, you'd be thrown in Leavenworth for that.
This week in Minnesota, Renee Nicole Good, an unarmed American mom, was killed by an ICE agent in the streets of Minneapolis, in her neighborhood. And almost immediately, the machinery of the MAGA propaganda machine moved not to defend her life, but to justify her death. She was no longer a person. She became a problem, a threat, a narrative to be managed. What followed wasn't accountability, it was deflection. And what makes this moment impossible to ignore is who is calling it out. Not activists, not politicians, veterans, people trained in war zones under rules of engagement far stricter than anything governing federal agents on American streets. One of the voices cutting through the noise is an Afghanistan veteran who served as a combat medic embedded with an infantry unit. His job wasn't theory or politics. It was keeping people alive in places where mistakes got everyone killed.
But cops are allowed to just be like, I was scared for my life. I was scared the whole time I was in Afghanistan. Multiple of my convoys were hit by IEDs. We had suicide bombers at the gate of our FOB. We were in combat for weeks at a time. And yet, the barely literate 18-year-olds that I were with had the training not to just pop off every time they got a little scared. Why do we expect civilians to react appropriately to terrifying situations if the guy with the training can't?
What he describes isn't chaos or panic, but discipline, a system built precisely to prevent fear from turning into unnecessary death. What his experience makes clear is that restraint was never optional. In combat zones, escalation of force existed for a reason, to give human beings every possible chance to live, even when danger was real. Soldiers were trained to signal, warn, de-escalate, and exhaust non-lethal options before lethal force was ever considered. Those standards weren't suggestions, they were enforced. Soldiers who skipped them did not get any sympathy. They faced investigation, court-martial, and prison. Civilians were expected to panic. Trained professionals were expected to control that panic. And that's the moral line being drawn here. If 18-year-old soldiers under the threat of suicide bombers can be trained to exercise restraint, then armed federal agents operating on American streets have no excuse for abandoning it. Fear is not justification when fear is the baseline of the job. And what followed next wasn't the truth the public so desperately deserved. It was lies. It was accusations. It was Nazi slogans like "one of ours, all of yours," and authoritarian cosplay brought to you by the Cruella de Vil of American politics, Kristi Noem.
You've also been criticized for your comments. The shooting, we should note, was Wednesday at 10:37 a.m. Eastern. Just over 2 hours later, the Department of Homeland Security put out a statement definitively asserting what had happened, defending the ICE agent, accusing Renee Good of domestic terrorism. That's a characterization that you reiterated in a press conference half an hour later. Now, Republican Senator Tom Tillis said, quote, "It was very unusual to have a senior law enforcement official to draw a conclusion about an event where the scene was still being processed. Generally speaking, law enforcement would recognize that a life was lost, that families are changed forever, the shooter's life will change forever. We're collecting video. We're trying to assess the situation. Why did you not wait for an investigation before making your comments?
Oh, well, everything that I've said has been proven to be factual and the truth.
The first thing you said was, quote, what happened was our ICE officers were out in an enforcement action. They got stuck in the snow. Correct. Because of the adverse weather that is in Minneapolis. They were attempting to push out their vehicle, and a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over and ram them with her vehicle. That's not what happened. We all saw what happened.
It absolutely is what happened.
We are expected to believe their twisted version of events, a version that collapses the moment that you look at the facts. No officer was run over. No officer was pinned or placed in imminent danger. What did happen was gunfire into an unarmed civilian's moving vehicle as she was leaving the scene, exactly as she was told to do. She was told to leave. Then she was told to stay. What does a normal person do at that point? This is a fight or flight reaction, and that's not politics, it's biology. She's telling people to go around her. She's preparing to clear the area. She tells an officer she's not mad at him. Then, as she begins to drive away, an officer standing off to the side pulls his weapon and fires 3 times as she's moving away. That use of force is restricted to the highest level of threat, and this wasn't that. She wasn't a suicide bomber approaching a military base. She wasn't charging a checkpoint where escalation of force protocols exist for a reason. She was a mother in her own neighborhood on a city street trying to leave a confusing and rapidly escalating situation. And that's the part the official narrative keeps trying to erase. There is a hierarchy of force. There are standards. None of them were followed here. And yet Renee Nicole Good is still being branded as the villain, while the people who pulled the trigger hide behind a uniform and demand that we accept insanity as truth. I was at an anti-ICE protest over the weekend. On Saturday, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in all 50 states after the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis. There were vigils on courthouse steps in small towns, marches, people pouring into the streets demanding justice. If you saw the scenes out of Minnesota and beyond, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Brave people standing up, because this isn't just about one life. It's about all of ours. Let me tell you something. I believe in law and order. I believe in our police. But what we are seeing right now with ICE across this country is unacceptable. People are being rounded up off the streets with no due process. And now federal leadership in Washington, D.C. wants to act like they can do what they want when they want. And this is the United States of America. This isn't North Korea.
Did you know that the big wireless carriers like Verizon and AT&T made over $18 billion in profit last year? How? By overcharging you for unlimited data, most of which you probably aren't even using. But what if you could get paid to use your phone less and only pay for the data you do use? Well, with Noble Mobile, you can. For just $50 a month on their No Bull plan, you get unlimited data, and whatever data you don't use, you get cash back right in your pocket. People who switch to Noble can save an average of $500 to $1,000 a year. It's a no-brainer. And by switching to Noble, you're directly supporting TYT and our mission of bringing you honest, independent news. So give Noble a try and make the switch today. Scan the QR code on the screen now or visit go.tyt.com/plan. That's go.tyt.com/plan.
Let me tell you something else people don't want to talk about. I wore the uniform for 24 years, and I can tell you from experience, that stuff changes you. It changes how you see the world. It changes how you move through it. In the military, that mindset makes sense because you're operating in a combat culture. You're trained for it. You're disciplined for it. You're held accountable for it. But these are American streets. These are American citizens. And somewhere along the way, we decided it was normal to dress law enforcement like they're kicking down doors in Fallujah just to police neighborhoods. We've confused looking dangerous with being professional. We've turned tactical gear into a costume and called it competence. We celebrate it. And then we act shocked when escalation replaces restraint. Old school policing used to mean something. Standards, bearing, discipline, professionalism. You had to rely on your training, your judgment, your words. Now, what I see all too often is gear without the culture, the authority without the accountability, and the back to blue mentality that treats any question as betrayal instead of demanding excellence. And here's the hard part MAGA morons don't want you to hear. Authority without accountability is not public safety, it's danger. When you normalize militarization without discipline, when you hand out power without demanding restraint, you don't get order, you get fear. A woman is dead, and before anyone tells me this is just about one incident, ask yourself why we've accepted this as normal. Ask yourself why questioning force is treated as treason, and why demanding standards is somehow anti-police. Because when a society stops insisting on restraint from the people with guns, it's not law and order that disappears first, it's trust. And once that's gone, the empire decides who lives and who dies. Families are struggling. Parents are working 2 jobs and still falling behind. Seniors are cutting pills in half to keep the lights on. Kids are going to school hungry. And while that's happening, the people in power keep finding money for militarized force, for agencies that operate with less accountability than the soldiers we send into war. This didn't happen by accident. It was by result of choices made by psychopaths like Donald Trump and Kristi Noem, and defended by an online propaganda machine that floods the internet with "I support ICE" slogans while demanding silence about who gets hurt. They tell us this is peace through strength. They tell us this is law and order. But there is nothing Christ-like about ignoring your own people, and nothing lawful about abandoning basic standards when power is involved. Veterans understand this instinctively. We were trained to follow strict use of force protocols because restraint is what separates authority from abuse. Those protocols exist to protect everyone, including the public. In this case, they weren't just ignored, they were erased. Gunfire was used where it should have never been, and the person who pulled the trigger was allowed to leave the scene. In real America, in any ordinary police shooting, the weapon would have been surrendered. The shooter would have been separated, questioned, and treated like the subject of an investigation, not shielded for one. That didn't happen here. Instead, the system closed ranks, rewrote the story, and tried to move on as if procedure and accountability were optional. Renee Nicole Good should still be alive. Instead, she's being turned into a villain to protect a system that refuses to look itself in the mirror and refuses to follow its own rules. And that's why staying silent isn't an option. Because when the people with guns are exempt from rules, the rest of us are no longer citizens, we're targets. And that is an absolute fact. Sappers clear the way, airborne all the way.